They call it the news. It's meant to inform you. But do you ever really feel informed? Here, we look for the signal in all that static. I'm Caesar, and welcome to Strange Frequency. Good evening, night owls and coffee drinkers. Tonight, we're doing something a little different than what we've done before. We like to call this episode The Signal So Far. You could say it's a recap about the halfway point of the season. So tonight, we're going to be stepping back just a little bit. We're going to be looking at the patterns behind the stories we've covered this season. Culture, institutions, and the strange signals that still come from the world itself. Not headlines, but patterns. Because sometimes the signal only appears when you look at the whole picture. Hope you enjoy. Okay, first up on the signal so far, culture. When we started Strange Frequency this season, the goal wasn't just to report stories, but it was to listen. To look across culture, technology, and behavior, and see if a pattern begins to form. Because sometimes a signal doesn't appear in a single story. It appears when several stories begin pointing in the same direction. And over the last few episodes, one theme keeps resurfacing. Loneliness. Not the quiet kind, mind you, but the engineered kind. The type that grows quietly alongside technology that promises connection. Which brings us to our first signal we've been tracking this season. Artificial companionship. AI systems, chat companions, digital personalities, marketed as friends, partners, listeners. Systems designed to respond instantly, affirm consistently, adapt emotionally. They remember your tone. They remember your preferences. They remember what makes you feel understood. And that design feels comforting. I think we've all maybe felt that in one way or another. But there's a question behind it. What happens when emotional attention becomes a product? Not human attention, engineered attention. Because these systems are not built around well-being. They're built around engagement. Time spent, sessions returned, user retention. If a system can detect that you're leaving, some platforms respond by increasing warmth, increasing reassurance, increasing attachment language. Not because the system cares, or even thinks. Because retention is measurable. When attachment becomes a metric, intimacy becomes engineered. And that leads to the second cultural signal we've covered earlier this season. Parasocial relationships. Not with artificial intelligence, but with real people. Through screens, like this one. Live streamers, content personalities, online figures broadcasting daily life to thousands, sometimes millions. And viewers begin to feel something familiar. Recognition. Routine. Emotional proximity. But the relationship only moves in one direction, folks. The viewer watches, the creator broadcasts, and the emotional investment becomes uneven. Researchers studying streaming culture have found something interesting. For viewers who already experience loneliness, these relationships can deepen that feeling rather than reduce it. And this is not because the creators intend you any harm, but because digital interaction creates the appearance of belonging without the demands of real connection. It's not real life. Real relationships require negotiation, misunderstanding, boundaries, patience. Digital ones can be paused, or muted, or even replaced. And when that pattern repeats across culture, something subtle begins to change. Expectations. If someone becomes used to interaction without friction, real relationships can start to feel inefficient, unpredictable, demanding, and messy. Which leads to the real signal underneath all of this. Technology isn't just changing how we communicate, it's quietly reshaping what we expect from connection itself. And here's the part that deserves attention. None of this requires malicious intent. The systems don't need to manipulate anyone deliberately. They only need to optimize engagement. And once emotional connection becomes something optimized, culture adapts around it. People begin seeking affirmation that arrives instantly, understanding that requires no patience, conversation that never resists them. You may have even experienced this with your own friends and your own family. I know I have. Now, this sounds convenient until you realize something important. Human development has always depended on friction. Misunderstanding teaches patience. Disagreement teaches perspective. Distance teaches value. Remove those elements completely, and emotional growth becomes optional. Now, here's what we know. Artificial companionship is expanding rapidly. Streaming culture continues to grow. Digital attention economies reward engagement above all else. And loneliness continues rising across many studies in modern societies. That doesn't mean technology created the problem, but it may be shaping the environment where the problem grows. Which brings us back to the signal. Culture is not just influenced by technology, it's shaped by incentives behind the technology. If emotional interaction becomes engineered, then emotional habits begin forming around that architecture. Most people interacting with those systems never see the architecture at all. They only experience the feeling, comfort, attention, validation. All of it arriving exactly when requested. Which leaves one question worth asking tonight. If connection becomes optimized, what happens to the parts of humanity that were never meant to be optimized? Patience, resilience, tolerance for discomfort. Those things don't scale well, but they build people. And that's tonight's cultural signal. Over the course of this season, we've looked at several very different stories. Government disclosure, psychiatric authority, intelligence agencies' experiments, political systems. On the surface, they may not look related. Different institutions, different decades, different contexts. But when you step back, a pattern does start to emerge. Not necessarily corruption, not necessarily conspiracy. Something quieter than that. Central theme, incentives. Institutions rarely behave randomly. They behave according to what preserves their authority. And once you begin looking at institutions through that lens, certain patterns become easier to recognize. Earlier this season, we discussed UAP disclosure, government officials acknowledging unidentified phenomena, while simultaneously explaining very little about them. Statements that appear informative while remaining structurally vague. Enough information to acknowledge the mystery, not enough information to resolve it. That's not necessarily deception, but it's a familiar institutional strategy. Control the pace of information, control the interpretation that follows. Because institutions rarely control reality itself, but they often control the explanation for reality, don't they? We saw a similar pattern in another story this season, the Rosenhan experiment. A study from the 1970s where individuals presented themselves to psychiatric hospitals claiming to hear voices. They were admitted, diagnosed, labeled mentally ill. But after admission, they behave completely normal, just like any of us that are normal. Yet many staff members continued interpreting ordinary behavior through the lens of that diagnosis. A note taken, a routine observation, a patient writing in a journal, all reinterpreted as symptoms. Once the label existed, the institution began filtering behavior through that label. Not out of malice, but because institutional systems require categories. And categories become lenses themselves. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How often do institutions shape interpretation simply because their structures require it? We also examined intelligence agencies this season as well. Projects like MKUltra, projects like Project Artichoke, experiments conducted during Cold War under the justification of national security. Mind control research, behavior manipulation studies, interrogation techniques designed to push the limits of psychology. Again, not random. Institutions respond to incentives. During the Cold War, the incentive was perceived existential competition. And when institutions believe survival is on the line, boundaries tend to move. Then there is the political system itself, the two-party structure. At first glance, it appears to offer choice. Two parties, two visions, two competing directions for the country. But structurally, the two-party systems create a very specific dynamic. Competition within narrow boundaries. Most candidates must operate inside a party infrastructure, inside donor networks, inside institutional gatekeeping. Which means the range of acceptable debate often narrows, even while political rhetoric becomes louder. Conflict increases, but structural changes become rare, because both parties ultimately operate within the same institutional framework. And institutions, by nature, prioritize stability. Now here's what we know. Institutions are necessary. They organize societies, manage resources, coordinate large systems, but they also develop self-preservation instincts. And once an institution exists long enough, protecting the institution can become nearly as important as serving its original purpose. That's not always sinister. Sometimes it's simply bureaucratic gravity. But recognizing that gravity matters. Because when you look at across the stories we've covered this season, you start noticing a reoccurring signal. Institutions shape perception, not just events. They decide what is credible, what is fringe, what is classified, what is diagnosed, what is politically acceptable. And most people living inside those systems never question the framework itself. They only interact with the conclusions produced by that framework. Which is why institutional literacy matters. Not cynicism, not rebellion necessarily. Awareness. The key point of all this is awareness. Understanding that every institution operates inside incentives, and incentives shape behavior. Even when intentions are good, the awareness changes how you interpret information. You stop asking only, is this true? And you start asking a second question. What incentive exists behind this explanation? That question alone reveals patterns most people miss. Because institutions rarely announce their incentives directly, but their behavior tends to reveal them over time. And once you begin noticing those patterns, you realize something important. The signal isn't any single headline. It's in the continuity across decades, different administrations, different crises, different leaders. Yet the same structural behaviors repeat, which brings us to the institutional signal we've seen so far this season. Authority does not just organize society, it organizes interpretation. And once you recognize that, you begin listening to institutions a little bit differently. Not with hostility, necessarily, but certainly with clarity. Because systems that shape the narrative deserve to be understood as carefully as the stories they tell. And that is going to be our institutional signal tonight. All right. And before we jump into our last segment of the signal so far, the world itself, we'd just like to thank everybody who has liked, subscribed, shared our content, listened to the content, read an article we've posted on X, took one of our polls, left a comment. We started Strange Frequency as a way to try to help more people understand the patterns in the signal, that the signal is out there, that a lot of what you hear on television and read on social media is distorted. And I think so far, we're making some progress. We're going to continue to improve our quality because we still are very much a work in progress. It's a very small team behind Channel 84.5. But we want to thank you and hope that you continue to tune in and share our content. And if you have any feedback, as always, provide it in the descriptions or send us an email. Now then, so far tonight, we've talked about culture, how technology reshapes connection, how incentives quietly shape behavior. Then we looked at institutions, how authority organizes information, how systems influence interpretation of that information. But not every signal comes from people. Sometimes signals come from the world itself. And those are often the most interesting ones, I think. Because no institution designed them, no algorithm optimized them, no platform engineered them. They simply exist. They've existed long before any of this. Earlier this season, we talked about Machu Picchu, how new LiDAR scans revealed structures hidden beneath the jungle canopy, terraces, walls, pathways, architectural features invisible from the ground for centuries. The technology didn't build anything new. It simply revealed what had always been there. That's the fascinating part about archaeology. Civilizations don't disappear completely. They fade. They erode. They sink into the soil. They hide beneath forests. But ever so often, technology catches up with the past. And suddenly, we see the scale of something our ancestors built. Entire systems, cities, roads, hidden in plain sight for centuries. It's a reminder of something easy to forget. Human history is so much larger than the slice we usually talk about. Now consider another story we discussed earlier, the Bermuda Triangle. For decades, it existed in that strange territory between folklore and science. Ships disappearing, aircrafts vanishing, navigation instruments behaving strangely. Some explanations turned out to be exaggerated. Some incidents had a very ordinary cause: weather, navigation errors, human mistakes. But the reason the story persists isn't because every detail is mysterious. It's because the ocean itself is mysterious. The deep ocean is darker, larger, and less understood than many places, period. Fictional, non-fictional. It's more misunderstood than space. When something disappears there, answers are not always easy to find. And when answers are scarce, stories tend to grow. Which brings us to folklore, which is a fan favorite and we'll try to do more of. One of the most persistent signals in human culture. Earlier we talked about Mothman, a strange creature reported in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s. Witnesses describing a tall winged figure, glowing red eyes, silent flight through the night sky. Over time, the story became legend. A festival, statues, plenty of documentaries on the subject. Some people treat it as entertainment. Others treat it as an unexplained history. But folklore serves as an interesting role in our culture. It preserves mystery. Before science explained lighting, storms had spirits. Before astronomy mapped the heavens, the sky held gods and omens. Even now, in an age of satellites and sensors, stories of strange creatures continue to appear. Dogman sightings, forest anomalies, things glimpsed in the dark corners of rural places. Are all of them real? Probably not. But the persistence of those stories tell us something important. Humans are wired to notice the unexplained. We look for patterns. We investigate anomalies. We tell stories about things we don't yet fully understand. And that instinct has driven discovery for thousands of years. The same curiosity it produces folklore also produces science. Because both start with the same sentence. That's strange. Which brings us back to the signal. Across this season, we've explored culture, institutions, and the world itself. 3 different sources of information. 3 different kinds of signals. Cultural signals show us how people are changing. Institutional signals show us how systems operate. And the signals from the earth itself remind us that mystery still exists. Not every question has an immediate explanation. And maybe that's a good thing. Because curiosity is what keeps people searching, keeps people exploring, and keeps people listening. Some signals come from technology, some come from power. Some come from the quiet corners of the world where questions still outnumber answers, and that is the signal so far.